Hey y'all, I'm Atticus, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Susan Miller and Doug Wheeler to our At Home with Literati series in support of A Beautiful Land. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping links to purchase A Beautiful Land throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. A reminder that you can shop for more books in-store or at Literati Bookstore for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now let me introduce tonight's author and moderator. Susan Miller is a clinical psychologist practicing in Ann Arbor. She is the author of 7 books, 5 psychology books, and 2 novels, potentially alternating. She is the winner of 2 Hopwood Awards in fiction from the University of Michigan and is an individual artist grant from the Michigan Council for the Arts. Doug Wheeler has been in private practice as a psychotherapist for 35 years and is currently the director of mental health at Congregations for the Homeless in Bellevue, Washington. His book, Reimagining Jonah, Fractures in Self, City, and God, is set to come out later this year. Doug runs a guest-centered podcast, quote, From the Belly, tackling a wide spectrum of topics, including racial inequity, toxic masculinity, and restorative creative projects. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Susan and Doug.
Thank you, Atticus.
Yeah.
Very much. Well, it's good to be with you, Susan.
Same here, Doug.
And it's good to have a listening audience, and we welcome any questions you folks might have. You can put them in the chat box, and those will be addressed at the end of our conversation. Susan and I are just going to have a conversation, and we're good friends, and we've done some prep for this. So I think we'll just get this party started with really the first question, and that is, Susan, what is your new book about?
Okay, well, I did give that a little thought since I thought I might get that question, but I guess I think of it as kind of a small painting on a larger canvas. And the larger canvas is a genocide that's beginning at the beginning of the story. And the smaller painting is really a family story, somewhat of a larger family, but at the center are 4 siblings. And because of the extraordinary circumstances that they're dealing with, you know, the story takes you into the lives and minds of each of them so that we see how this violence in their society affects them individually, but also how it affects the makeup of the family. And it really is a pretty ordinary family. You know, they have a lot of tensions. Certainly envy is one of the tensions within the family, but also a lot of glue that connects them. So the way we see them come apart in certain respects, but also come together. And one thing I was trying to do in the book was to look at how some of the tensions in the family paralleled some of the tensions in the larger society, but yet the outcome is very different in the one situation than the other. I don't know if you want me to go into that more or.
Oh, sure. I think that'd be fine. Yeah, okay. You bet.
Because I think in both situations, there's envy, competition, but in the larger world, in addition to those forces, there are a lot of kind of higher ups in the society, voices of authority that actually fan the flames of all these sort of aggressive tensions and push to tribal society, so push one tribe toward extreme violence toward the other, justifying it, even requiring it. So I think without that, external influence, the outcome would have been very different. Whereas, so in the family, in contrast, you have parental figures, but they're comforting figures. They value the solidarity of the family, so things don't devolve into violence. In fact, there's a lot of attachment.
So that must speak to your awareness of what happens in a genocide, the history of that, and just as you say, these powers that are influencing. Because as I read through the book, there's not a lot of explicit detail about those powers, but that you get a sense something clearly shaping this. But you as an author were very aware of that. I'm sure that informed how you even moved this family through this trauma.
Well, and I had to, to do a fair amount of thinking about really what kind of forces could underlie such an extraordinary set of events. I know when I had written the first draft of the book, and I was focusing on the family story, but I really steered clear of those questions about causality for the genocide because they almost seemed too big to touch, or it felt presumptuous to think that I would have the answers to any of these questions. But a good friend, writing professor, basically said, you got to go there, and at least pose questions, not necessarily answer them, but at least pose them and put forward some possible explanations, and then let the reader take those, think about them.
So you got a little bit of a nudge or a push to go into a space.
I did, and yeah, that's really what good editors are for. And in this, actually, with this book, I had a wonderful editor who was really invaluable.
One thing I did want to say, I didn't find one error in the book. I mean, that's a whole another thing about just grammatical errors and how that can just throw somebody. I mean, it's amazing how many revolutions of editing that a book will go through, and then you'll find one. And I mean, I try to have grace for it, but it always irritates me just a little bit. Like, how did this end up in here? And yours didn't have one.
Well, now I have to say, Doug, you weren't reading closely enough.
Oh, I wasn't reading closely.
It could be that one of my sisters is in the audience, and she did send me a short list.
Oh no!
Of errors.
Your sister.
I think we found 3.
Oh my gosh! It tells you what kind of reader I am.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't see them.
One of them, I have to say, bothered me, but the others were minor. But
is that just part of the writing process?
The fact
just,
that
just to have your book finished, and we can talk about as we get into this conversation other things that you would have maybe hoped for the book, but just touching this lightly, is it just part of the process that after all of the work and all of the editing, something still, I mean, nothing's perfect, right? Is it just part of the process that an author accepts?
For me, absolutely, no question about it. You could read 1,000 times, and every time you make changes. Sometimes I tell myself, okay, if you change this word in this particular run through, if you change this word back to the word it was before the last run through, and you change it to this word, then you might be done. But I think we all have our ideals, writers who we just profoundly admire. I know I do. And so they kind of sit in your mind. And I think for me, when you finish a book, it's never exactly what you want it to be. But sometimes I say, well, it's what I was able to do. So
that's right. I
did the best I could with it.
You did the best you could.
And it's, at some point it has to be done so you can move on to something else you want to work on.
Can you tell us about choosing the title?
For me, titles, names, sometimes I'll just put something there almost as a working title and assume that it would get replaced. But in this case, I discussed it with my editor and publisher, and we all just decided to leave it be. And I think for me, it was just, it's a pretty simple title, but it conveyed the fact that the people came from a land. Some of the people end up in exile, so they don't stay there, but that was certainly physically beautiful. And in some respects, it was beautiful as a homeland.
Hmm.
But then in other respects, it was about as far from beauty as one could imagine. So, there's
Hmm.
that ironic aspect to it.
I love the title. I love the front cover too. There's something about a
Oh,
good
thank
cover of
you.
it. I just love it.
Yeah.
I
Well,
love it.
the publisher gets credit for that.
Yeah, what's
Yeah.
beautiful, and even the tactile, the feel of the book. It's just interesting that
Mhm.
I always enjoy just reading a book. And I talked to somebody recently who just said, "Yeah, I just don't want it on the screen. I want to hold the book and read the book." Of course, that's up to the reader, and some people like both. But I like the feel of the book too.
Yeah, me
Just
too. And I think, I mean, older readers, of course, we grew up with physical books and libraries and the smells of libraries and, old books, new books. So I think those tactile aspects
mm, beautiful.
are really important. I sometimes feel bad, to think that younger people seem to get so many aspects of their life through the screen as we are in this moment. But
Right on.
not that it's bad, but it, doesn't seem as richly varied.
Mm. Who do you consider to be the protagonist in the book? Does the book have a protagonist?
Well, I do consider the young woman Raisa to be the protagonist, although the story does move off into other people's
Mm.
worlds, and
It sure
so
does.
for parts of the book she isn't even figuring so much. So at least she's the initial protagonist,
That's
and
right.
then it circles back to her at least a little bit.
Yes, it does.
Um,
Tell us about the development of Raisa. How well do you know her?
well, actually, not as well as I would like to, and I often feel that way about a character. So I'll write something, and I know with this book, there's definitely a process of, there's three young women in the well, more than three, but three for a long period of the book. And I kept going back thinking, okay, they really need to be better differentiated. They need to have their own
Hmm.
psychology, their own language. And that's always hard, to achieve that unless a character is extremely well delineated in your mind. But so I'd say I know her pretty well, but sometimes she would surprise me.
All right.
Sometimes she was leading and sometimes I was, but
Hmm.
in terms of like the plot and
Mhm.
there's a friend asked me the other day some hard questions about some of the plot elements, and I was thinking about it afterward, and I thought, well, I'm not sure I chose those, plot elements. I think the character chose those, and then
Hmm.
my job afterward is, almost with like a psychotherapist with a client to say, well, why did you do that? You kind of
That's right.
try and get to that understanding.
Hmm. Yeah, we've had those moments in our work,
Yeah,
haven't we,
yeah,
Susan?
yeah. But I think with the character, I'll ask that question, and if I can't get any kind of an answer back, then I'll think, maybe I can't. This isn't the right way to move the plot. If I'm not really understanding why I'm doing it. But if I can, you know, have some sense of the reasons, then I'll go forward with it.
During the process of writing this, did you have any vivid dreams that you would wake up to and that really would inform the direction of the book?
Boy, that's a hard one. I started writing this book probably 10 years ago, and then I put it away.
Hmm.
Then later, much later, I had a publisher. So since I had this publisher, I went back to had to do a lot more work on the book. So I, re-inhabited it. But I think the answer is that none that I can remember, to
Hmm.
be honest.
But it still could have
But
informed, right, from the unconscious. It still could have informed
oh,
things.
no question about that.
All right.
Even though it's not dreams informing it, I think there's no question it just flows, fiction to a great
Hmm.
extent flows out of unconscious
Hmm.
sources. It flows from unconscious sources. And you
Spe-
sort of ride, I think you kind of ride that horse of the unconscious and try
Hmm.
and rein it in and direct it a little bit, but you have to let it go. You let it run, or otherwise you can't write fiction, I think.
Hmm. That that'll be helpful for people listening who are attempting to write fiction. And I assume in the listening audience, there are those that are possibly right now they've hit a wall, and maybe they put their work up out of frustration, or maybe they've just put their work up
Sure.
for some other reason, just because they're onto something else or whatever, and maybe they'll reach back and pick something up.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
but
guess to just say as a therapist, a fair number of people have some interest in writing. So
hmm,
I think the thing that I've encountered the most is people they just can't put aside the editing critical part of their mind to let that unconscious work be, sort of
hmm,
flower. Um, I struggled with that myself as a young person, got better at it, got better at just writing, letting it come, and knowing that you're going to have all kinds of opportunities to revise later, rethink. You don't have to do it all at once.
it's good to hear. Very, very good to hear. I'm sure people are very interested in the book, and they're also very interested in the writing process. So I've got questions that kind of fit both of those things, and we're already discussing those. Let's talk for a minute about Raisa. Um, I'm sure you're, if you haven't had this question, I'm sure you've had it, but you'll get it more. Uh, you chose an interesting name for her son.
Oh yeah.
I'm gonna let you
Okay. Well,
introduce
her
that
yeah,
too.
her name, but the son's has one name, and then she changes the name
Right.
to the name Do Good,
That's right.
and 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 this is one of those things that when I was writing it, I just slapped that name on there, and I thought, well, no way am I going to stick with this. It's ridiculous, right? It sounds so silly.
Hmm.
And it is silly, but I ended up keeping it. And in some ways, I ended up liking it, although I've had some serious complaints again from family members, if you're out there, about this name. Um, but I think the reason that I like it is because, one of the complexities and sort of immaturities of this particular character is that she really sees the world in terms of good and evil, and she works hard to maintain that split. She wants to believe that the things she does are good, and the things that others do, particularly this tribe that is so violent toward her people, are all evil. And of course, she's living in a world that promotes that kind of split. During a genocide, it's pretty easy to split the world in that way. But yet she makes some choices personally that really are more complicated than that. They're not all that good. And so I think with that name, it sort of picks up uh, the simplicity of her thinking, or the determination to stay in this world where if you just do good, you are good, and simple as that.
Hmm. Hmm. I don't.
But it still is a silly name. And maybe I
Oh,
should have changed it.
no. I think that it sure got my attention, and it made me wonder about the choice of it, and also just made me wonder about how this young boy experiences his own name.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
right, and the book never explicitly says that I remember of him having, kind of an inner conflict around the name, as if some kind of pressure's been put on him to do good, all of that. But
Yeah,
it's
there's a little, you might not be
some of that.
remembering, but there is some conversation about that.
Okay. But I think it made me as the reader wonder in a good way, to stay open to, I wonder how this is going to develop, and I wonder how he carries this. Let's shift to a different character. Why did you include the attack on Rita, Raisa's sister?
Yeah, and that
A violent attack.
very violent attack, and I actually added that after I'd done an initial draft, and there I did have a clear reason, which was that I felt like, in a sense, to do justice to the reality of people's lives who do experience this kind of ethnic violence, that it's brutal, and that it leaves terrible scars. And so I didn't want to soften it. I thought maybe I was too much. And so I was trying to, let that experience and then all the aftermath of it, at least, without totally overwhelming the reader, signifying that level of trauma.
She, to me, at least the first read, and you can read a book again and then you connect because of whatever's going on in your life or whatever. You read the book differently and you connect with a different character. She's the most interesting to me. Not that the other characters are not interesting. I don't mean to say that at all, but I just want to know more about her. There's something about her that is, because Raisa is clearly strong in a way, and determined and headstrong, and there's something about Rita. You talk about resiliency. There's something about the resiliency of her that I was really drawn to.
Yeah. And she might be the one that I ended up feeling that I knew the best.
Interesting.
Question. Yeah.
Interesting. And how about her relationship with Dogood? Rita's relationship with Dogood?
Yeah. That I did struggle with some, but again, I was trying to push the narrative a little bit into some somewhat darker spaces with this notion again that being on the receiving end of this kind of personal violence is very damaging, and it really troubles the waters deeply and permanently, really. So I was trying through that to talk about her longings for some of the things she wasn't able to have in her life, not just because of the attack on her, but also because she had a birth defect, and that figures in as well.
That's right.
So so through this relationship, she expresses, and sometimes inappropriately expresses, these longings for a child, for a partner. Maybe also, I think in some ways the do-good character for Rita and Raisa represents a kind of purity or perfection that children often do represent for adults. He has a sort of physical beauty about him. In fact, the original title to the book when I was writing it was A Beautiful Boy, not Beautiful Land.
Oh, interesting. I could see that.
I changed it. So I saw him as representing that for both these women, and to some extent their determination to keep him in that posture of representing this kind of innocence is destructive for him. It doesn't really work for him. It may to some extent work for them. But he's struggling to integrate things that are far from beautiful into his sense of himself,
Mhm.
because of his the fact that his parentage is his parents, his blood parents, biological parents belong to the aggressor tribe
Yes.
in this
Yes.
genocide. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, I think this would be a great time for you to do a reading.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that.
I trust you have the
Uh,
book in reach and you
I
can do that
have the
for us.
book in reach.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And I did pick out a few pages, and these
Right.
pages are pretty close to the beginning of the book. Um, I think they illustrate, both that larger canvas of things moving in the direction societally of violence, but also a smaller little vignette that is Raisa's story of falling in love with this young man, becomes an important part of the book. So
Yes.
here we go.
All righty then.
So years rolled past after the time of childish games. Peace held, but the dyspeptic rumblings beneath the kindly surface were louder now in Unwanse. Day after day, Raisa saw her father's worried calculations about resources for escape and routes the pursued could follow. She noticed when his eyes passed from child to child, as if he were counting the number of lives in his keeping. Somewhere in midair, his eyes would join Mama Jig's, also tight with worry, and the fear would travel from one to the other, knitting a canopy over their children. Two simple people without wealth or importance, how are they to bar such evil from their doors? Their afternoon meal ended with fried banana, everyone's favorite. Afterward, Papa and Mama stayed at the table drinking their tea. Raisa overheard Papa say, "Think of our neighbor, Simon. He fancies himself a man of business, but he has nothing to sell and nothing with which to buy. He looks at Annette in her stall, and I see the burn of envy in his eyes." "What can you do?" Mama asked. "Simon is Simon. He is one of them." "At times I wish we had no cow to covet," Papa said, "no window glass to desire." Raisa grew impatient with her father's distraction. She stood by his elbow and said, "I ran all the way up the broad hill to Corrie village today and did not stop, not one time." She was fibbing, but only a little. Papa left the table and stood by the window, looking into the air. Mama Jig went to him and said, "Hush now," though he hadn't said a word. Raisa saw that Mama heard his thoughts in the rocking of his heart. Raisa heeded those too. She went and stood beside Mama Jig and said, "You are hearing ghosts, Mama. Papa's not said a thing." Most times she could coax Mama out of her severity. She had an easy route to Mama's heart. Raisa was 18. She had a boyfriend named Dunn. He was a boy like a lantern, easily lit. He helped Papa repair their fine floor and exclaimed over the beauty of the wood. His family had only packed dirt. He brightened for Raisa too, but she feared his delight in her was par with his other pleasures. That made the love between them unequal because she held him at the very center of her heart. Mid-morning of a cloudy Saturday, Dunn came to exchange news with Janvier, one of the sons in the family. Raisa offered him poetry, saying, "I had a dream about you, and your eyes shone red like the sun when it sits just a quick minute on the horizon, as if it is rocking there. But I woke before it finished." "That's pretty," he said, and touched his fingertips to hers. But she saw his eyes drift elsewhere, and he asked, "How did your father have money enough for such a pretty floor?" She did not want to talk about floors. "You are pretty," she said, and turned her smile away from him while her eyes sought him. Her lips grew soft and full, and gathering courage, she pressed them against his. His lips, too, were tender pillows. She wanted to pull him behind Annette's barn and entwine with him in the soft rain. Dunn sensed her need and laughed and stood back from her. "Wait a minute," he said cheerfully. "You hurry too much." "Because I want you." How could he not notice her shapeliness? "Yes," he said, "but in time." She didn't like the buts in his sentences. Her sentences had no buts, and she had no patience with words of caution. Buts were for old men or for parents tense with warnings. He made her stamp her feet. A violent fever came running down the broad hill and galloped through the village on the back of April's thunder. Easy as a hand smashing a mosquito, it struck people down. The illness infected Papa and spun up a fever that made him shiver and ache. Mama Jig led him to bed. "Stay now, we are tending every little thing. You go and rest, old man." They took turns bringing him soup and helping him through the rain to the outhouse. Even in his misery, he tried to clear the care from Raisa's eyes with a joke or a story. "That boy with the bright eyes, he flies to you like the moths go to the light." "Hush, Papa," Raisa said, embarrassed because his words were false and shined a beam on their opposite, that she was the one flying. "Raya, how many babies do you want?" She wanted to swat at him, her hand flipping back and forth and crazy, but he was too weak. "Oh, yeah, you talk too much. Get your business done." She waited outside the outhouse, mad that he took his teasing too far. While she lingered, flicking the rain off her face, she pictured Dunn turning his back to her, lured somewhere west, then turning his back again, this time drawn eastward.
Mm,
There you go.
beautiful. Beautiful. Susan, what is your writing process?
I am not somebody who has a strict writing schedule. I think maybe I should be one of those people, but I'm not. I'm a little bit more of a catch as catch can writer because I do have other parts of my life that are very scheduled. But I just try and write often enough that I don't kind of lose the feel for the story, and my sense of easy, immersion or engagement with it.
Do you, could you give us an idea of, is there a little bit of a rhythm to, you might write on a Tuesday and then you might return back to it on a Friday? Does it?
Well, yeah, I try and write a few times a week at
Okay.
the minimum. Now, sometimes I'm really enjoying what I'm doing and I'll, open up the computer file and start working at 10 at night, so it could be just any old time. Or I'll go to bed and turn the light on 5 times because I keep thinking of things that I want to write down. But
Okay.
But other times, it's a little more of a push to keep going. I try and keep the fun in it, I guess I would say.
Well, that's interesting because I was going to
Yeah.
ask. So, do you ever push? Are you ever in a difficult moment where you're having to work at writing, but for some reason you stay with it and you find value in that? You're not having fun with it, or do you just say, if I'm not having fun with it over a period of time, I lay it down, I return back when I'm a little bit lighter? What?
Well, no, I think I have more of a sense of work, like a work ethic around the writing. So yes, come back and work on it. And some days it's more fun than others. And I used to, I don't do this so much anymore. Maybe I'm more pollution conscious, but when I would get stuck sometimes, remember one time in particular with a book that I just couldn't figure out where it needed to go. And so I would just get in the car and drive around, and I would find that the driving would occupy that nervous part of my mind that was getting in my way, and just let the less conscious things sort of bubble up. And usually then you could find a solution. I mean, I remember in that case, I was writing something that was it was the first novel, and it had more autobiographical elements than anything I'd ever written. And I was really stuck with the story and driving around, and I just realized what the problem was, which was that I had to liberate the story from my life. I had to liberate it from reality because it needed to have the structure of a novel, wasn't a memoir. It needed to have a novel structure. And if there wasn't anything I could find in the actual events that gave it that structure, I better just make them up because time had come. So that really was a help.
That was an important moment, and that set the course for. Wow.
It was. It really let me go forward.
Thanks for sharing that. I think it's those kind of insights that really help the aspiring writers and maybe even people that are accomplished. Speaking of writing, you published 5 psychology books focused on the emotional states of shame, disgust, horror, fascination, awe. What is your attraction to the study of emotions?
I started down that road in graduate school. I needed to do a project. It was basically like a master's thesis. And I didn't know what I wanted to study, but I knew that I wanted to, I just didn't want to be counting things and doing statistics, just wasn't drawn to any questions that I could evaluate in that way. And I did have a professor who was very engaged with interviewing research, George Rosenwald, who's a wonderful psychologist. So I was thinking more along those lines, but still didn't know what I wanted to do. And I actually had a memory. It had to do with my mother and a moment in time where she was displaying what I thought was a disgust emotion toward one of her family members. And I just felt curious about that moment, not profoundly, but enough that I thought, aha, maybe here's something to study. So I really went from there, and then I discovered that disgust was a pretty interesting topic. I actually wanted to continue down that road with my dissertation, but I couldn't find anybody in the faculty who would work on that topic with me.
I remember you telling me that story. That's an interesting
dynamics of disgust. People want distance from it. So that moved me into shame, which was, I guess, more acceptable topic, although a little less interesting to me. And then, just went back to disgust and one emotion to another.
Interesting. And you've had a lot of success in the nonfiction world, but according to the conversations that we've had, I think it's clear that, your heart and your mind at this part of your journey, this novel writing, this storytelling, this is the direction that we could say that your soul is directing you.
Yeah, definitely. I don't see myself writing another psychology book. I think that tank is a little bit, it's not empty, it's kind of down there. I could be surprised, think of something that I would really like to write about. But the fiction, I started writing fiction before I was interested in psychology, and it's persisted. And I think for me, it's just it's such a big challenge. It's like the higher hill to climb, and I always feel like I can't get where I want to. So I better write another book, which would be better. So you can do that for the rest of the time. But
give yourself some rest for a period of time with a beautiful land. So how does your knowledge, I'm really interested in this, and I know this is a big question. We've only got a few minutes left because I'm sure we're going to be fielding some questions. How does your knowledge of these emotional states that you've studied, that you've worked with in your practice, that you've written about, how do they manifest in a beautiful land?
You had asked me that when we talked before this, and
Yes.
so I thought about it a little bit, and really, I don't think they do as much as you might think. In other words,
Hmm.
I don't ever in writing fiction say, okay, I've studied horror, so I'm going to write something that's rooted in some knowledge that I've established on that topic. Never. But it might be the case that, the same mind and heart that's drawn to thinking about horror as a psychological topic is drawn to writing fiction that touches
The touches.
on that same topic. And it might be the case that, I mean, usually for me, the process is more that the book kind of starts to write itself, and then I think about, well, what is it that I'm writing about?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I might write something and then step back and think, well, maybe some understanding of the dynamics of disgust or something might help me a little bit here with this character, but not as much as you'd think. It's like parallel play, parallel tracks, I think.
Okay. Okay. I'm thinking it, and I think this is maybe what you were getting at. It's equipped you to be able to handle a topic like genocide. It's equipped you to be able to do that in a, I don't know if this is the best word, but I think it's a good word for it, in a respectful way. Because I think what I appreciated about the book, I know you, so this might be informing as I read the book, but it stood out to me that you didn't go too far in explicit detail of the genocide in a way that I think there's a fine line there that a reader can experience that they're not a celebration, but there's just too much detail in this. It's like it's trying to create, some kind of shock or something.
Mhm.
This
The
book
sort of
does not.
the
This
pornography of violence that people
right,
talk about sometimes.
right. In this book, there was ample opportunity for an author of this book to do that because of the topic, because of the way this family is set in the context of all of this trauma. You didn't do that, and I really just want to compliment you on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I did want it really to be it's a story of this particular family because there's any huge event on the world stage is ultimately about individuals and
That's right.
particular families
That's
and
right.
how that event hits them.
You referred to an earlier conversation we had about this topic, and that's when you mentioned, because I asked you a similar question, and you talked about the disgust and the emotional state of horror. And you made a comment, and I've thought about this since we talked. You said, Doug, I had to push myself to write about to add those into the story. Do you remember saying that to me? I had to push myself. And I wanted to ask you, could you say a little bit more about what you had to do with yourself to push yourself into that disgust and the horror and to include that into the story?
Yeah, I think I was probably referring to that one scene with Rita, which is this
Okay.
violent sexual attack, which, yeah, was just unpleasant to think about, to write. I noticed I had to read through this manuscript so many times, as part of the editing process. And every time I got there, I wanted to just push through it or skip around it. I did not, it discomforted me,
Okay.
even though I wrote it,
You stayed with it, and I know for the people that have been victimized in those ways, you honored the character of Ritha to do that.
Mhm.
You honored her in that. So
When you do, of course, as you full well know, that as a therapist, it's not so unusual that you hear about things that are truly traumatic, and you have to kind of push yourself to stay with the person because you want to run away. It's
So true.
painful. Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. This might be our last question. And I'm going to let the listening audience know that this question is a question that you had sent me a list of questions that you said you write a blog, and that's at susanmiller.com. Correct? That's the right address. Yeah.
Susan Beth Miller, actually.
Susan Beth Miller. So
Yeah.
I encourage folks to go to that. There's a lot of good information on that. But you provided some questions, and you said, Doug, just pick and choose of any of these. I found this a fascinating question, and I'm not asking the question. I'm just repeating the question. You wrote it, and I thought, wow, what a humble thing for an author to do. What are the overall strengths and weaknesses of the book?
Oh, well, did I send you that?
Yes, you did.
I was actually trying to, somebody had suggested to me that I should post some book club questions, so I was trying to think from the perspective of a book club conversation.
Okay.
But
then you can do whatever you want to with this.
Yeah. I will say one weakness for me is some of the events aren't as well I don't have as full of an understanding of them as I would like to. They sort of led a little bit by the character, and then I come in later and say, okay, again, why did you do this? So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Anything else that you want to loop back? Well, let me ask one other question back to some specific, a specific part of the book. I'm very curious about this. Back to Raisa, back to Do Good. Why did you choose a forest to be the place where Raisa raises Do Good?
In part, I think that just comes from who I am and the environments that are sort of rich and meaningful to me. But so it seemed like, I guess, a combination of both a threatening environment, but also a sort of rich and nurturing environment, and a place, where she could. She sort of tried to make her own little world, right? That was protected on both sides, like protected from the genocide, the violence which she had left behind, but really also protected from her family because she had abandoned them, and she wasn't ready to face them, and also to deal with some of the lingering childhood tension. So she finds a sheltering place, although it does have some threatening elements, where she can create this little world. Ultimately, it has to end. It can't go on forever. It ceases to work. But
I didn't know that about your love, let's say, for the forest or for that kind of space. But wow, the images that you paint. I mean, I got lost in the forest.
Okay. But one of my favorite books,
in a good way.
I'll plug an author. This year I read the book Overstory, which is all about trees.
I know the book.
I just love that book. Just loved it.
Great. Well, I want to encourage anybody that's listening in, that's holding a question. Please don't be bashful with your question. You have an opportunity to not only ask about if you've read the book, but also if there's anything you want to ask Susan about the writing process. Please take this opportunity to do that. So we'll wait for Atticus, who's, there he is.
There you are, Atticus.
There's Atticus.
Hi, y'all.
Hello.
Yeah, well, just wanted to just while questions are maybe being posed by the folks who are here, one question that I had was for kind of the both of you, and wondering if you could talk about what maybe you have in common for your writing processes? Because I know you write very different things.
Wow.
But thinking about what both of you have in common and what you do that is distinctly different between the two of you, and how that feeds each other in this conversation, but then also specifically A Beautiful Land in this
Doug,
one.
maybe I can hand that one to you. And well, just at this point, you know more about my writing process than I do about yours. I mean, I know Doug is writing a really interesting book on Jonah, the biblical story looked at from a very different point of view than the usual, Old Testament mindset. But I don't know very much about your writing process.
Oh, it's such a threatening question. And the reason being is
There is no process.
I tell you, my process feels like such a unprocessed or well, I started the book in 2016, and I wrote and rewrote the book so many times. It reminds me of when I was doing my dissertation for my PhD. I wrote that and rewrote that so many times. And so I asked my wife, I invited my wife into that space, and I don't think I would have a PhD if it wasn't for her. In this book, not only the editing work that she's currently doing on the book, but also just helping me really understand what I was trying to do. The book was born out of my own trauma. And initially I gave I don't know if this is so much about my writing process, but I did a presentation one evening about the contents of the book. And I've considered myself to be a better speaker than writer. I mean, I'm much more confident just talking. And so I made this presentation. It was all in the support of a book that back then was going to take longer to write than I ever thought it would, even though I'm encouraged to hear that Susan said 10 years, even though you put it away for a period of time. Mine started in 16, and we hope to have it on the shelf in 2022. We hope to have it done. But I gave this talk, or this really unique creative presentation. Atticus, you're the one who asked the question, so I'll answer to you and to Susan and to whoever else is listening. And when I was done with the presentation, and I read some of the work that this was in 2017, so I read some of the work that I was doing at that time. Somebody came up afterwards, actually a dear friend of mine, a wee bit older than me and kind of an elder in my life. And he did two things. Number one, I knew this might challenge some of his own theological beliefs. So he really challenged me on some of that, and I was okay with that. But then he said at the end, he said, I think you've got your story so wrapped around Jonah's story. I don't know where your story begins and ends and where his story begins and ends. And I said to him with confidence, I'm really good with that, because that's how wed I am. That's how connected I am to this character. But as I've sat with that, and I wrote more, of course, and I'm still finalizing some things, I think it reminded me of what you said, Susan, when you took that drive and you were able to make that distinction between, is this a memoir or whatever? I think I was able to get out of the way enough to let more of Jonah's voice come out. It really is about a prophet who was an oppressed child and was indoctrinated, the way I take it, was indoctrinated with a bunch of religious stuff that shaped and molded who he was. So when he runs from the call from the divine, he's not a coward. He's running. He's actually running for his life. He's running to save himself. So I wrote the book through that angle. But back to your question, it's been a messy process for me. So I think I'm starting to trust myself more through the process. Thanks for the question.
And one thing I would say, listening to you, Doug, is that I could identify with what you're saying about the messy process. And I think sometimes writers who have a messier process, there is some shame there, right? You think you're supposed to be getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and writing for 6 hours. And there are absolutely writers who work that way, but not everyone. And, however you get there, however messy it is, it seems to me it's okay.
That helps.
Yeah.
Well, Susan, is there anything else you'd like to say about your book before the top of the hour here?
Um, No, other than of course the obvious that I hope people will read it, and if you have thoughts about it and want to share them on my website, there's a comments portion of the blog. Please feel free. I'd love to hear from you. I'll write you back. So thanks for
Yeah.
coming. And thank you, Doug, very much.
Oh, absolutely,
Doug
Susan.
has a great podcast, which is how I know him. So um,
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're kind of to the top of the hour here. So thank you,
Wonderful.
everybody. It's
Thank
been an
you.
honor, Susan and Doug, and thank
Atticus,
you to
thank you.
everybody who's
yeah,
here.
thanks, Atticus, and thanks to Literati for hosting.
Yes, thanks, Literati.
Yeah. Make sure to go buy A Beautiful Land at Literati. We've got it online and on the shelf.
Absolutely. Susan and Atticus, thank you. Bless you
All righty.
both.
Thanks, y'all. Have a lovely night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.